Welcome to another episode of Erik Wait Whiskey Studies, and in this video, gonna do a side-by-side comparison of the Bowmore 12-year-old, 15-year-old, and 18-year-old Islay single malt Scotch whiskies. So I'm gonna do a side-by-side comparison between these three different whiskeys. We'll look at the visual components, see if we can tell any difference between the color of these three different whiskeys, the viscosity, length of tiers, and so forth. Then we'll compare the aromas and the flavors and see if we can tell the difference between the age impact on these whiskeys as well as the slight difference in the ABV. And then finally, I'll give you a quality price ratio evaluation of these whiskeys. But before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about the profile of these three different bottles. The Bowmore 12, 15, and 18-year-old Islay single malt Scotch whiskies are all aged in ex-bourbon and ex-sherry casks. The Bowmore 12-year-old is bottled at 40% alcohol by volume and sells for about $53. The Bowmore 15-year-old is bottled at 43% alcohol by volume and sells for about $90. The Bowmore 18-year-old is also bottled at 43% alcohol by volume and sells for about $160. We can presume that all three of these bottles have had some sort of cold chill filtering and color adjustment using E150A. Now, it might be a little challenging to tell the difference visually between these three whiskeys given this camera. I took some close-up shots and video to see if I can give you an idea of what these look like. Now, one of the challenges is, as I stated there in the notes on these whiskeys, is potentially these have been color adjusted. But if they are, well, then they have done some color adjustment to have some uniformity, because they didn't just drop a bunch of E150 into it to make them a particular color, because there are some differences between these three. These get darker as we increase in the age time. Again, maybe challenging to see on the camera. So the first one, the 12-year-old, here on my right, it has a slight orange color to it, a slight tanning color to it. It's a little bit more watery going to the rim. The viscosity, it seems very thin, doesn't really hang around a whole lot. The tiers and legs on it are fairly thin. This is not something I regularly do on my whiskey reviews, because I don't think these are huge tellers in the quality of whiskey. Tiers on a glass, it can tell you sugar level. A really sweet wine, for example, such as Sauterne, is fairly thick and they can hang around a lot longer. Alcohol level, heavier alcohol can hang around a lot longer on the glass, but also other things such as the temperature as well as the cleanliness of a glass. If you don't have a real nice clean glass, or if there's happen to be just a slight soapy residue, which hopefully you would smell and you would know whether it was really clean glass or not, can cause it a little bit of drag as well. So the visual doesn't tell us a lot. I would not spend a lot of time on the visual, other than to know that, yeah, slow forming, slow dripping tiers, but still looking rather thin. And if you watch some other videos online by even people who are more well known in the whiskey industry, will go on and on and on about the visuals. I think they're making a lot more out of it than is actually there, in my personal opinion. Nevertheless, when I look at the 12-year-old, particularly if I can get it up to light, and it looks a little bit more golden in comparison to the 15-year-old. The 15-year-old, I'm already starting to see a darker orange. There's a slight reddish color to it, sort of a brick red color to it, a little more orange and golden around the sides. Slight sheeting tiers. I'm not into shaking my whiskeys. You do your whiskeys however you want. Personally, I just prefer a gentle roll. And the third one is just a touch bit darker. We're going more into a tawny color there, which if these were not color adjusted would mean more extraction from a cask or a wetter cask. However, the wine, the remnants of the wine are getting into this spirit, whether it's extraction from a cask or, a wet cask, would you just have some remaining whiskey? Again, it's something we don't know. Unless we know something about the integrity of the casks and how the casks were treated, whether they are refurbished casks, whether they were wet casks, whether these are seasoned casks. There's so much that you don't know that can affect, or you are told, that can affect the visual component of these whiskeys. So normally, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. So let's move on. On the aromas, now, you can see I've gotten a lot further down on this one. That's because I've already reviewed this one, and I've shared this with other people. These ones, I'm right about hitting the label. I've had a few drinks. I've done a lot more side-by-side comparison between the 12 and 15-year-old. On the nose, in terms of how much comes up out of the glass, it's fairly moderate. It's not a big punch in the face. There's no tingling sensation. No burning sensation. That is the first indicator, potentially, of the alcohol level if I was doing this blind. The first one it's a moderate amount of peat. That's the first thing you notice is the smoky character to it. But it's very moderate. It's really interwoven with the fruit notes. On the fruit notes, there's a slight orange citrus, perhaps a little bit of lemon, just a hint of dried black fruit notes. Going to the 15-year-old, it's more dense, it's earthier. There's more of the dried black fruit notes, less of the citrus. It's still there, just less of it. There's a greater concentration of the smoke and peat character. Both of these have a slight chocolate note. That chocolate note increases when you're going from the 12 to the 15, now the 18. The 18-year-old has the most dramatic increase in the intensity of the aromas. The peat is much more prominent. The smoke is much more prominent. The chocolate character is much more prominent. But this is relative in comparison to the other two whiskeys, not into other Scotch whiskies. Compare these to the southern neighbors of Ardbeg, Laphroaig, and Lagavulin, and these are all quite moderate. Spice is showing up more, baking spices. There is a fudge character as distinct from chocolate. Some vanilla, dark caramels. Let's go back to the 12. I'm now getting more baking spices, like dried cinnamon. There's more of a dramatic increase from the 12 to the 18, obviously. But even in the incremental increase, imagine if you're turning knobs up to increase the intensity of the aromas. The increase from the 12 to the 15, and then from the 15 to the 18, because we're going at 3 years from here to here, and 3 years from here to here. The increase in the intensity between the 15 and the 18 is much more dramatic. There's more of an increase between these 3 years than these 3 years. There is a certain freshness to the 12-year-old in comparison to the 15 and 18 that are much more earthy in character. Particularly the 18-year-old. Hard to define this term or quantify this term, but the 18 is also richer. If you could, say, compare a chocolate cookie versus a fudge brownie, it's a darker and richer nose. All three of them have a slight ashy character to them. So the 18-year-old doesn't seem peatier than the 12 or the 15. They all have, and it's just slight ashiness to it. Let's go for the palate. On the 12-year-old, there isn't a whole lot of transition. Not much difference between the front and the middle end of the finish. The intensity is low to medium in terms of the flavors. The smoke and peat is interwoven with all the other characteristics, and it's present in the front and the middle into the finish. There's no competition between the peat and smoke character and the fruit character. The fruit character is a dried orange character, sort of a dried dark bread character. There is a hint of more of a milk chocolate and just a slight spice on the finish. So in case you're wondering, I am using a white cloth to enhance the visual component of this when I'm looking down at them. Also, I have a glass of water off camera, so occasionally I'll take a sip to sort of cleanse my palate as much as I can in between glasses. One of the challenges of peated whiskeys, at least for me, is if you're doing a lineup of different peated whiskeys, the peat sort of saturates your palate, and what you're tasting, say in the second glass, may actually be a carryover from the first glass, not to mention third, fourth, fifth, or how many glasses you're doing, but at least I can try a little bit to cleanse the palate with a little bit of water. Now let's move on to the 15-year-old. Again, you can tell the intensity of the smoke and peat has been turned up just a little bit. The character of the fruit has been turned up. It's a dried oranges, that dark brown bread character is there. Spice. The raisins are showing up a little bit more intensely than on the 12-year-old. Some baking spices. You're getting more of a fudge character and just a hint of ash on the palate. In addition to being slightly more intense and more concentrated, it's also, I would say, more acute coming down the center of the palate. The smoke and peat is more concentrated. There is a darker, richer chocolate character. The fruit characteristics are going more towards raisins, getting more towards figs. The smoke and the peat is moderate, particularly in comparison to Lagavulin, Lafroig, Ardbeg, or say Octomore or Port Charlotte from Bruichladdich, or even Kilchoman or Kalila. So this is the signature of Bowmore Distillery, that moderate and well interwoven peat character as well as the ABV levels. Now, if I was doing this blind, none of these come across with the intensity or sharpness of the southern neighbors, which are, except for the Lagavulin 16-year-old, which is 43. All of Ardbegs are 46 and up, and Lafroig, although Lafroig 10-year-old in the UK is 40 ABV, here in the United States 43 ABV, but in that the rest are higher than that. But Lafroig has its own distinct character in terms of the seaweed, oceanic notes. I don't get the oceanic character from any of these whiskeys that you would from Laphroaig. I do get a slight saline note or saltiness to it, but they don't have that iodine and medicinal notes that Laphroaig has. Also, color-wise, unless it's none of the core range bottles from Lagavulin have this color, with exception perhaps the Distiller's Edition, which you can get in a PX cask. So, if I was doing this blind already, based on the intensity of the smoke and the peat, based on the color, because Ardbeg uses primarily bourbon casks, with the exception of an O, which has PX, and Ugadal, which has Oloroso. The rest, you're looking at bourbon casks. So these are all distinctly Bowmore whiskeys, given the profile of the color, the intensity of the peat, the low ABV, and the moderate peat and smoke character into the whiskey. All right, back to the 15. It has an even sweetness all the way through. It does dry a little bit more towards the back end, and you're getting more of the dried black fruit notes. All right, let's go on to the 18-year-old. So the 18-year-old, again, fairly, moderate legs. You don't get a whole lot of sheeting there. On the nose, it's richer, more of a dried black fruit note, fig, dates, raisins, prunes, and a dark concentrated chocolate. A hint of saltiness. There's actually a slight nuttiness there, which isn't common with the other the other two. There is I would say, significant increase in a sulfur note coming from the sherry cask. I wasn't getting any, if there is a sulfury note in the first two, it's very slight in comparison to the third one. I'm not real sensitive to sulfury notes. Some people, sherry casks will totally turn people off because they don't like a sulfury note. It's just a hint there. It's not real intense. But on the 18-year-old, it shows up much more dramatically than on the 12 and the 15, which more intense extraction from the cask, an indicator that this is older than the first two if I was doing this blind. Yeah, probably the biggest significant is a darker concentrated of chocolate, so more of a darker chocolate, darker dried black fruit notes, and that sulfury note is really starting to kick in there. On the palate, darker chocolate, it's sweeter, spicier. There's a dark chocolate, but also milk chocolate component, dried black fruits, figs, dates, raisins, prunes. There's like a chocolate covered raisin note there. It has a longer finish in comparison to these two, but in comparison to peated whiskeys outside of Bowmore, these are all fairly moderate. The main characteristic that in terms of the palate in all three of these, that's an unfortunate thing, but I think it's a sign that these are Bowmore, is the mid palate feels thin. They feel watery. Now, quality cask and time will give you a greater extraction out of the cask and more intense flavors, as we've seen here. But in terms of the mouthfeel, these all feel rather thin. 40 versus 43 ABV, it's not a significant difference. Doing these blind, would I be able to tell that, hey, this is a 40? This is a 43? Not necessarily. And the reason why is, if these were both the same age, and one was at a 40 and the other was a 43, it'd be easier to tell the difference between a 40 and 43 ABV, because it'd be the same age, same intensity of extraction from a cask. But the greater extraction from the cask due to time is somewhat distracting in terms of being able to detect the differences in the AB level only going up 3 ABV. It's not a significant difference to go from 40 to 43 ABV. This was at 46 and this was at 40. It'd be a lot easier to tell. So it's fairly easy to tell. These are all within that 40 to 43 ABV. All three of them feel rather thin, rather light in the mid palate. The greatest intensity of the flavor of these whiskeys is about 3/4 of the way into it and into the finish. There is a lingering character of the cask character from all three of these whiskeys, the greatest concentration being from the 18-year-old. But there is no kapow or aha moments there. There's nothing here that it is overwhelming you. There's nothing here that is going to just really wow you. There is no wow factor in these whiskeys unless this is your first time drinking whiskey and you're primarily a beer drinker or a whiskey drinker, in which case something even as low as 40 ABV is going to seem quite intense in comparison to a 14% ABV wine or an 8% beer. So what do I think about these whiskeys? One, quality casks, number one. Two, I like the moderate level of peat in all these. Islay Distillery needs a moderate intense peated whiskeys so that you have more of a range representation on Islay of the different levels of peat. You got your more intense southern neighbors, and then obviously Octomore, Portchal from Bruichladdich, Kalila. Kalila is much more intense than all these. In terms of intensity of peat, the closest to this is probably Highland Park off of Islay, but Highland Park tends to be spicier on the finish. There is spicier, but it's subtle to moderate in comparison to Highland Park. I will do a live stream in which I compare the Bowmore 12 with the Highland Park 12, but that'll be another time. So Bowmore is needed in terms of the intensity of peat and the way in which they do peat on Islay. I wish they offered in their core range something with a higher ABV, 46% minimum, not filtered, natural color, something more for the whiskey aficionado. These seem much for the consumer who isn't intellectually involved with their whiskeys. Someone who's not spent a whole lot of time thinking about it. It's just a casual drink off to the side, or someone who is a newbie. Now, if you like Bowmore and Bowmore is your favorite, like what you like. I like Bowmore, but I'm much more impressed. I found much more in love with either independent bottlings or with bottles that I brought back from the distillery, such as the 18-year-old Fischel edition, which was absolutely spectacular. I wish they had something, even though that's cask strength, didn't have to be cask strength, but at least 46% alcohol by volume. Now, what I'm going to give these in terms of scores. The 12-year-old, I'll go 85. The 15-year-old, 86. There's a slight margin. And the 18-year-old, which I've reviewed before, maybe an 87. I don't recall what I gave before, but 87. So, which tells you there's only like a point or two difference between these three, but there's a significant price difference. You're talking in the 50s for the 12-year-old. Of course, prices vary according to wherever you live. In 52 to 55, somewhere in that range, and $160 for the 18-year-old. This 18-year-old is getting pretty low. I will not be replacing it, and yet, unless I need to, for preparing for exams. There is another bottle in the core range, which is the 25-year-old. The 25-year-old is at $450 to $500. and it's not any higher in ABV. I'm not spending that kind of money for 40 to 43 ABV whiskey. Sorry, I'm just not doing it. For that same amount of money, I can buy a whole lot of better whiskeys. So I ain't doing it. These are good whiskeys. They're not, particularly the 18-year-old, is not a quality price ratio whiskey. The best bang for the buck, quality price ratio, and I don't know what your budget is like, it's probably going to be the 15-year-old. Probably going to be the 15-year-old. It's, in that $80s to $90 range. It's probably what I'm going to go for. If you're new to whiskeys and you're just getting introduced to peat, sure, start off with the 12-year-old. But probably quality price ratio between the three of these, I'm probably going to go with the 15-year-old. I know I only gave it one additional point. Points scores are relative. They're not coming from Mount Sinai. They're not coming. Take it for what it is. To get them over 90 points, all of these would need a greater concentration of flavor, a greater range of flavor, a better transition, a longer finish, and particularly a better mid palate, to get them higher than what I've given them, to get them over going into the 90s range. And typically what that's going to need is higher ABV, non-chill filtered. Color's not going to affect that so much. So, alrighty, that's it for this whiskey study. If you like watching my videos, like and subscribe if you've not yet subscribed. Please do so. And if you have any comments, if you have any questions about what I've done in this video, if you've experienced any of these whiskeys, I'd like to read about your comments and questions down below. All right, until next time. Cilantro.
Hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out these other whiskey videos.